Herod the Great was a remarkable man, the greatest builder in the history of this Bible land. He rebuilt Jerusalem and made it a Greco-Roman city. He rebuilt the temple, and when Jesus taught in the temple, it was Herod's temple. He built a new seaport, Caesarea on the sea, where the Apostle Paul was imprisoned for 2 years. But along with these new cities, Herod also built palaces and fortresses for himself all over the land.
The most spectacular was at Masada. Masada is a great mountaintop fortress overlooking the western shore of the Dead Sea. And this is the most awesome of all the building projects of Herod the Great. This mountain of rock is 1,300 feet high, and it looks like a ship sailing through the sands of the Judean desert. Herod knew about Masada long before he built his fortress here. Before he became king, he had been forced to flee to Rome, and he had left his mother in Mariamne here on Masada. Mariamne was the Maccabean princess that he would later marry. Later, when Herod wanted to build a palace fortress that could withstand any siege, he chose Masada as the site. The summit is surprisingly flat and 1,900 feet long. It must have taken an army of workers to do all this building, and in the summer the temperature climbs to 130 degrees here in the desert. After Herod's death, Masada was an outpost of the Roman army. Then in 70 A.D., Jewish zealots seized Masada, and 3 years later their last stand became one of the most heroic moments in all Jewish history. Herod built a double wall. Archaeologists call this a casemate wall, all the way around the edge of the summit. This meant that if an attacking army managed to scale the cliffs, they still faced a double defensive wall, and there were 37 watchtowers on the wall. Herod made sure that no army could mount a successful attack against Masada. Across the wall, we look down to the Dead Sea 1,300 feet below, and to Moab over on the east side of the sea. Herod had 2 palaces on Masada. One was a large western palace. The other was an amazing 3-level palace clinging to the north end of Masada. From the top, we look down to the middle level where the circular foundations remain, and to the lowest level further down. From the side, we can see how the palace clings to the mountainside, a remarkable feat of ancient building. The Israeli Army engineers have installed a steel stairway, and this makes it possible for visitors to see all the palace. We're now on the lowest level of Herod the Great's 3-level palace. It's 105 feet from the highest level up there down to the present level. It's decorated with beautiful columns, frescoes on the wall. Josephus knew about this palace, described it in his Antiquities, and people doubted the accuracy of it till the excavations were done here. And now we know that it's just exactly as Josephus described it. The walls between the columns are plastered and painted to resemble marble, and they still look like marble after 2,000 years. Why was this palace built here? To catch the cool breezes that nearly always blow across the north end of Masada. Near the palace on the summit, there are large storage rooms. Many of them have been excavated and restored, but some have not. When the zealots seized Masada, these rooms were filled with Roman weapons and food, and this is how the zealots were able to hold out for 3 years. Masada also had a synagogue built into the outer wall. It's important because it's one of the 2 oldest synagogues ever discovered. It was in use as a synagogue while the temple was still standing in Jerusalem. Archaeologists found a number of biblical manuscripts on Masada, and some were buried here in the synagogue in a little chamber called a geniza. It's interesting that another manuscript found on Masada is one of the Essene documents from Qumran, and this shows that there may have been some Essenes among the zealots at Masada. Palaces have to have baths, and these are the pillars in a Roman caldarium or hot bath. And these are some of the beautiful mosaics from the palaces and the baths. Notice the black restoration line on the walls. This shows where the ancient walls were still standing intact, but above the line they have put the stones back in place. Herod had an outdoor bathing pool with broad plastered steps going down into the pool.
And he even had a larger swimming pool, all the comforts of Jerusalem here in the Judean desert.
What about a water supply for this great fortress? The rainfall in this part of Israel is no more than 2 or 3 inches per year, but the engineers of Herod the Great had built a series of dams around the base to trap the water, and then they carried it to the summit by slaves or animals and deposited the water in a number of cisterns here on the summit. These are the steps going down into the largest of the cisterns. This one will hold more than 1 million gallons of water.
Herod lived in a world without cable cars. So how did he and his family get up to their palaces? They climbed. There was a steep path on the Dead Sea side that led up to the top. Josephus knew about this path, and he says that it was called the Snake Path because of its continual windings. It's so steep and narrow that a handful of men on the summit could hold off an army. Archaeologists have found this snake path, and today it's a strenuous 40-minute climb up to the top. Herod may have ridden a horse or a sure-footed donkey up the snake path. Today, Masada is a national shrine to the people of Israel, and this is because of the Zealots' last stand here in the summer of 73 A.D. When Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D., a band of Zealots seized Masada, Josephus says, by treachery. There were 960 of them, men, women, and children, under the leadership of Eleazar ben Yair. Safe here in Herod's fortress, they defied the Romans until the spring of 73 A.D. Then General Flavius Silva, the procurator of Judea, brought an army of 5,000 men and laid siege to Masada. They built a siege wall and army camps around the base so that none of the Zealots could escape. From the summit, we can see one of those camps with the siege wall below it. But how could anyone attack Masada? No army can scale those cliffs 1,300 feet high. General Silva's strategy was to use Jewish slaves and build a great siege ramp up to the summit. Look at the size of that ramp. No telling how many slaves died here as they toiled in the desert sun. When the ramp was finished, the Romans moved their war machine up the ramp, a siege tower and a battering ram, and they knocked a gaping hole in the casemate wall. That night, Eleazar called his men together here in the synagogue. They all knew that they would be overwhelmed the next day, and Eleazar pleaded that death would be better than crucifixion and rape and slavery, and the men agreed. They set the buildings on fire, and then every man bade his wife and children a tearful farewell and killed them with his own sword. Archaeologists found the sandals and the braided hair of one of those zealot wives. Next, 10 of the zealots killed all of their comrades, and then they chose Lot to see which one would kill the other 9 and then fall on his own sword. The archaeologists may have found those lots in this room, pieces of broken pottery with a name on each one. One name is Ben Yair, the leader of the zealots. The next morning, when the Romans stormed up the ramp, instead of the last desperate fighting they expected, they found the bodies of 960 zealots who had chosen death rather than slavery. And Josephus says that the Romans stood in awe at such courage. When Yigael Yadin excavated Masada in the 1960s, he found the remains of some of those zealots, including some of the women, and these were buried in a memorial mound at the base of the Roman ramp. Joseph Shulam, an Israeli who lives in Jerusalem, explains what Masada means to him.
As an Israeli, I feel that Masada is important for 2 main reasons. One is the great tenacity of the zealot warriors in Masada for freedom. And of course, the second thing that it reminds me as a Jewish Christian is that the temple was destroyed and that we lost the battle because of our sins. As Eleazar ben Yair, the general, or the captain of Masada, of the Jewish zealot forces in Masada, said in his last speech that is quoted by Josephus, that Jerusalem fell because of our sins. And this punishment is befalling us because we have been displeasing to God. So Masada has a dual message. One is a message of valor and bravery. The other one is a message that sin always brings a calamity.
Masada is a symbol of the national spirit and patriotism in Israel today. It is the Alamo of the ancient world and far more to the people of Israel. There are certain elite units of the Israeli army that come to Masada at night, take their oath of induction into the Israeli army, and then make the vow, Masada will never fall again.
And Masada is a reminder to every Israeli and to every Jew that you don't have to give up.
Oh, praise the Lord, all ye nations.
Herod must have felt a sense of security in mountaintop fortresses. The Maccabean kings had built the fortress Alexandrium on a mountain 18 miles north of Jericho. Herod restored this fortress in 38 BC to guard the Jordan Valley. And when Herod executed the two sons of Mariamne, the Jewish wife that he loved so dearly, he had them buried here at Alexandrium in the tomb of their Maccabean ancestors. And there was Herodium. Herodium is another of the great palaces that was built by Herod the Great. It's located about 3 miles east of Bethlehem. Herodium was also built on a mountain, and even though it looks like an extinct volcano, it's a natural hill, and atop this hill, Herod built a circular palace 7 stories high. This is the only palace that Herod named for himself. It has 2 circular walls, which we can see here, nearly 40 feet apart, and with rooms built in the space between the walls. Inside there's a large open area 200 feet in diameter. It's about like a modern hotel built in a circle with all the rooms looking down into a large circular atrium. Today, when we stand on the walls and look down into that atrium, it seems again that we're looking down into an extinct volcano crater. The main living area of the palace was located down in the atrium. On the east side, there was a large courtyard that was decorated with columns and fountains and gardens. Many of these columns are still standing today. In Herod's day, it must have looked like a beautiful garden sunk in the heart of a mountain. On the opposite side, there were the family living quarters and baths. Herod had a complete Roman-style bath with hot and cold rooms. The beehive architecture here in the bath is very interesting. Notice how the keystones hold the dome together. The royal tombs at Mycenae in Greece from the 12th century BC have the same beehive architecture, and Herod's builders copied it here. Herodium also had a synagogue. This synagogue and the one at Masada are the 2 oldest synagogues ever discovered. Notice the stone benches around the walls, just like the one at Masada. Herod built 4 large towers in the outer wall of this palace. 3 of them are semicircular, and they extend out from the wall. But the one on the east is a full circle, 55 feet in diameter, and is solid masonry all the way through. Herodium was both a palace and a fortress, so it's not surprising to find these catapult stones piled here. After the palace was finished, Herod piled earth and stone up around the lower stories, and it's only these lower stories below ground that have survived. But there is more to Herodium than the mountaintop palace, which the archaeologists call Upper Herodium. Lower Herodium is at the base of the mountain, and there's another palace down there that is 400 feet long. The foundations of this building can still be seen, but not much more. Lower Herodium also had a large pool 210 feet long and 9 feet deep. The stone walls are 5 feet thick and plastered to keep the water from leaking out. There was an island in the middle of the pool with a circular building and columns on the island. This pool was probably used for swimming and boating, but it also served as an architectural focus for Herodium. An aqueduct 3 miles long brought water to the pool. The complex of buildings at Herodium covered about 45 acres, and this made it the largest palace in the empire. Later, Nero would build a larger palace at Rome, but at the time, Herodium was the biggest palace anywhere in the Roman Empire. Herodium is never mentioned in the New Testament, but it was a familiar sight to all who traveled around Bethlehem, and when Jesus crossed the Mount of Olives from Bethany to Jerusalem, there was Herodium sticking up on the horizon. An intriguing archaeological puzzle here at Herodium is the location of Herod's tomb.
Herod died here in this palace in Jericho, and after his death his body was carried to Herodium for burial.
Josephus tells us about Herod's death at his winter palace in Jericho, and he tells us how the body was placed in a coffin of solid gold and carried in a funeral procession from Jericho across the Judean desert to Herodium for burial. An Israeli archaeologist, Ehud Netzer, has spent the last 10 years searching for Herod's tomb, but to no avail. Some scholars think that Herod's tomb is hidden somewhere in the massive East Tower, but Netzer does not agree with this. The Jews never buried the dead in a building where they lived. Tombs were always outside the city. Netzer discovered a large monumental building between the pool and the base of the mountain. This building has the finest stone work, and Netzer thought this would prove to be the entrance to Herod's tomb cut into the side of the mountain. But Netzer found no tomb. Most scholars think that if Herod's tomb is ever found, it'll be empty, looted long ago in antiquity. But there is the intriguing possibility, however slight, that the tomb might be found undisturbed with gold to rival King Tut's tomb in Egypt. When Herod the Great was buried here at Herodium, there was little mourning in this land. He was an Edomite, not a Jew in race, and the Greco-Roman culture that he loved and admired was anathema to the Jewish people. But Herod the Great left a legacy that would never disappear from this land. Entire cities and palaces built all over the land, many of them still standing today. If Herod's tomb is ever discovered, the epitaph should read, Herod, the greatest builder this land has ever known.